Anachronon?
Anachronox.
Okay, Anachronox is a sci-fi RPG/adventure game released exclusively for PC in 2001 by Ion Storm. And there are way more unique and unusual things about it other than just its title. For starters, it's a Western JRPG developed in the US, with some aspects resembling PlayStation-era JRPGs like Final Fantasy. It was also developed using the Quake 2 engine, despite being about as far as humanly possible from a first-person shooter. And these oddities are only the tip of the iceberg. Anachronox is packed with wacky, bizarre characters, tons of weird humor, and an imaginative universe, all of which rival even some of the zaniest and most original sci-fi media I can think of. Right from the very beginning, it's extremely obvious that its setting and characters are bursting with creativity and charm, and this doesn't let up for the bulk of the 40 hours or so it takes to finish. But for all the things it gets right, it does still have flaws and some gameplay elements that just haven't aged very well. It's not a game that ever achieved widespread popularity, but it did gain a pretty strong cult following, as these kinds of flawed masterpiece type games usually do. Reviewers mostly praised it back when it released, but that unfortunately didn't help it sell many copies, which definitely wasn't helped by issues during its development that are almost as strange as the game itself. Anachronox's lead designer was Tom Hall of Doom fame, and Anachronox was developed at the same time and in the same building as the infamous flop Daikatana. Problems with that game's development were so extensive you could write a book about them. In fact, someone did. And there was some very negative press about the Ion Storm Dallas studio at the time, detailing inner turmoil with things like mass resignations, which along with some questionable advertising, hurt the studio's image with the public. The history and drama of Ion Storm Dallas is very well documented, so I won't go into great detail about it here. Most of the drama was related to Daikatana, but apparently some of it bled over and made life more difficult for the Anachronox team too. And they also faced plenty of challenges on their own. Anachronox was delayed multiple times, the story had to be cut in half because it was too long, developers lived at the office working insane hours and had to finish up the game essentially knowing that their studio was about to get shut down, which it did, like immediately after Anachronox was released. All of this makes me a little surprised that this game even exists, and even more surprised that it turned out as good as it did. So without further ado, let's get into it. Anachronox kicks off like any good story should, with its protagonist getting repeatedly punched in the face and then thrown out a window. This is Sly Boots, a down-on-his-luck private detective who's like a combination of Harrison Ford characters with the snappy, confident dialogue of Han Solo and the trench coat of Rick Deckard. The window he just gracefully fell from was part of his office above a bar, and after he knocks back a few drinks, you meet another main character, your mouse cursor. Inside of it lives a digitized woman named Fatima, who used to be Sly's secretary, but then she died and had her consciousness uploaded inside of a life cursor. I told you this game is creative. She helps you out by spinning whenever you hover over something important, keeping track of your quest log, giving useful advice, and reminding Sly that he's a lazy bum.
When did you become such a bum?
I'm not a bum.
Prove it.
Switching between the movement and cursor controls takes some getting used to, and the life cursor does create some plot holes, like when your party splits up and somehow Fatima is still with everyone. But overall I love this idea, and I haven't ever encountered anything else quite like it. Initially, Sly's only mission is to find a job, any job, to try and pay off his debt to a local crime boss named, wait for it, Detta. And then you're let loose to explore the southern part of Anachronox, a mysterious alien planet that's thought to have once been the home to quarantined aliens who all died from a plague. But now it's a big city area inhabited by shady characters from all over the galaxy. From a visual standpoint, Anachronox is a pretty strong opening area with some intriguing points of interest, neat little gravity-shifting paths between zones, and enough style and futuristic elements to give off a cool cyberpunk vibe. But something that's hard not to notice, here and in a few other places, is that visually there are some really high highs and low lows. What I mean by that is you'll travel through these rich and detailed open areas, and then suddenly be in a very bland or narrow hallway. I do feel like the highs outweigh the lows, and overall the environments are definitely one of the game's strengths, but it was hard to ignore the dichotomy here. In other ways unrelated to that, the opening areas on Anachronox remind me a lot of Midgar from Final Fantasy VII. Both are dark urban slums where you spend such a significant portion of the early game that you start wondering if the entire game is going to take place here. And then suddenly you leave and the universe expands to all of these colorful, unique, and very diverse planets, each with their own distinct theme and vibe. You'll visit high-tech worlds, low-tech worlds, and mys-tech worlds, which is a term for important magic artifacts that play a major role in the story. The variety here is great, and it's really worth noting how much certain areas differ from one another. You'll go from a dark, menacing spaceship to a cozy winter village, to a desert town filled with Chewbacca's, and then to a military base where all the generals chew you out. And don't even get me started on the red light district. No, really, don't get me started. Even the dialogue boxes change color or style in some places, which is a nice touch and actually has a decent effect on the mood of these areas, simply because you spend so much time in conversations. Some fantastic art direction and strong atmospheres in most of the major areas makes for some very memorable locations, and that's without even considering the story elements that actually bring them to life. A few of the late game areas don't look as impressive, and neither do some of the combat zones, but even that and the hallways I mentioned earlier aren't enough to bring down what I think is an otherwise great looking universe. And that universe wouldn't be complete without a soundtrack, and the music definitely helps make many places enjoyable to explore. The main tracks are calm and ambient and sometimes have a futuristic tone. They're very relaxing and mix well with the scenery to really bolster the atmosphere. I'm sure most people today will think the blocky character models haven't aged well, but I think they're actually pretty charming. And the developers seem to get the most out of their limited technology when it comes to things like conveying emotions. Plus, some of the character designs are just hilarious. When the first NPC you meet in a game looks like this, you know you're in for a wild ride. Honestly, nobody else really tops him, but there are plenty of other weirdos out there, and lots of different aliens like Sunburnt Cyclops, Roid Rage guy with mutton chop horns, and whatever this is supposed to be. The enemies aren't quite as creative though. Some of them I really liked, like these maniacal looking bears with hypnotizing eyes, but others just seemed kinda generic and didn't really pop out as much as some of the NPCs did. So even with a couple of negatives, presentation-wise, Anachronox is pretty solid so far. And that's before really getting to one of the best parts, the cutscenes. And there are a lot of these. Anachronox is a very story-focused game with more than 2 hours of cutscenes. The transitions between gameplay and cutscenes are often very smooth and seamless. And the cutscenes themselves are remarkably cinematic, thanks largely to the camera work, which uses a ton of stylish angles and shots. This extends to other parts of the game too, like when you travel between certain areas, mainly on elevators. And yeah, it looks pretty cool here at first too, but the problem is this plays every time you ride an elevator, and some places have a lot of elevators. I think I've actually rode real elevators faster than this. Thankfully, there's an unofficial patch which comes included with the Steam and GOG versions of the game that adds a fast forward button, and this is an absolute godsend, not just for elevators, but other aspects of the game too, which I'll get into later. So besides being stylish and cinematic, another reason the cutscenes are such a big part of Anachronox's lasting charm is the voice acting, which is far more often than not swelling with personality. You have silly, eccentric characters with performances that add levity to an already absurd narrative, and then there are the slightly more serious characters who have professional performances that I don't think would sound out of place on a high-budget animated TV show. I like the way some characters sounded more than others, but I didn't hate any of them, and even some of the minor characters who are only in the game for a scene or two sound great. Tom Hall, the lead developer, even has a role voicing Sly's robot sidekick.
Hi. Can we pull you aside for a second? Hi.
Hi?
Hi there.
Hi!
Yeah, this is gonna sound funny,
Peculiar, really.
but we heard
Through the grapevine.
that you had an unusual
Condition.
accident that left you
Unusual.
with one leg.
Anachronox's story is really what shines above everything else, although the actual main plot isn't always the biggest attraction. The plot is very slow-paced, and it doesn't even really get going until a few hours in, and even after that, major plot developments are usually pretty spaced out. What's there is quite good, but it's also what fills the gaps between some of the big plot moments that really help elevate the story to something special. Subplots in certain areas do a good job of keeping you engaged while you're visiting there. And most of all, it's the interactions between your party members, the world building, and especially the humor that make the story so awesome. Saying this game doesn't take itself too seriously would be the understatement of the century.
Very nice.
There are lots of random NPCs almost everywhere you go. All of them have dialogue, and many of them have quite a lot to say. And sometimes they'll even respond differently depending on which character you're using. The dialogue is packed with personality and humor that ranges from being relatively subtle to extremely weird and downright ridiculous. A lot of the conversations are totally optional, but I can't imagine playing this game without trying to talk to everyone because the writing is usually just that good. There's a lot of random silliness, which is occasionally a little juvenile, but I don't think it ever goes overboard with that. Guards are hilariously brutal and love threatening to beat your face in, or reminiscing about other people's faces they've already beaten in. Some NPCs have funny names with pop culture references or play on words, like Dr. Einburnt Alstein and the Meatles. One of your missions is to find and deliver a smelly, pus-filled crusted sock to a guy named Eddie who lives in a junkyard so that he can chew on it to help him concentrate and use his psychic powers.
Eddie knows.
Yeah, whatever.
And you'll encounter a major villain who, right before his boss fight, threatens you by saying this.
I shall kill you with death.
This style of humor sorta reminds me of old LucasArts adventure games, and there's an interesting enough narrative behind it all to keep the silliness from feeling overwhelming. A lot of the conversations are also dedicated to helping explain and build up Anachronox's universe, and the sheer amount of creativity here is another major reason why the story is so good. One of the planets you visit, called Democritus, has a government so obsessed with being democratic that they vote on every minor decision, to the point that it slows them down from ever really getting anything done. When your party visits here, they have to vote in their elections, and then save them from an alien attack because they're too caught up in the democratic process to do anything about it themselves.
Give us a fighter. We'll take out this hive while you guys bicker about it.
And then to thank you, they use their futuristic technology to shrink the planet so that they can join your party.
Surprise! We've come to compensate you for all your generous help.
Shoot me.
That's right, now you roll around with an entire planet at your side. It can talk to NPCs, it has an important role in the story, and it fights in combat, and is actually probably your strongest fighter. They even use satellites to give it little eyes. This is amazing, there's really no other way to say it. And I honestly think Democritus belongs right here on my list of all-time favorite party members in any RPG. And while this is definitely a peak moment in the game creativity-wise, there's plenty more strangeness out there too, so that you're always wondering how bizarre and unique the next planet you visit might be. The characters in universe are just packed with originality and soul, and even after reading some of the horror stories about Anachronox's development, I still have to imagine that the developers had a lot of fun making it. Obviously none of the other characters are as cool as Democritus, but they have their moments too. They definitely fit the mold of a ragtag group of misfits trying to save the universe, but some individual uniqueness helps keep them from feeling too typical. Sly is a likable enough protagonist, and most of his humor comes from him being kinda stupid, and sometimes solving problems through dumb luck or with help from others rather than his own competency. The main plot begins with Sly's quest to find a job, leading him to an eccentric old man named Grumpos, a kind of half Gimli, half Gandalf looking guy who, you guessed it, is pretty grumpy.
Smartass.
After proving himself useful in another matter, Sly manages to get work from Grumpos, who wants his help locating a piece of mistech. These mysterious alien artifacts don't have any known use, yet. And this is where things start to pick up. Grumpos is determined to learn how to activate mistech and decides to seek out a brilliant scientist on a nearby planet. Sly still needs to pay off his debt to Detta, and Grumpos promises that they can get rich off mistech if they unlock its secrets. So Sly tags along and brings his newly reactivated robot pal. His name is actually Pal.
Pal? Pal? Hey, pal!
Without getting into spoilers, I'll just say that the plot starts getting interesting once you meet up with this scientist Grumpos is looking for. She joins your party, terrible things start happening, and after a while you learn that the entire universe is in peril, so you start traveling all around the galaxy trying to save it. Eventually, you start learning little tidbits about Sly's past, involving Fatima's death and another character that joins your party later on. This part of the story has a much more serious tone than everything else, and it adds some nice depth to Sly and Fatima's characters. I thought the circumstances surrounding the universe's possible destruction were pretty intriguing, but these flashbacks with Sly managed to grab my attention a lot more, especially since there are a few breadcrumbs about them sprinkled around earlier in the game to pique your curiosity. The main criticism I've seen people mention about Anachronox's story is that it ends with a cliffhanger. There were plans for a sequel, but since the studio shut down, that obviously didn't happen. I already knew about this before finishing the game, so I was able to brace for it, and I gotta say I wasn't quite as disappointed as I thought I'd be. I mean, yeah, it does suck that the story will never be truly complete, but as far as cliffhanger endings go, I thought it wasn't half bad, and it definitely caught me off guard with how things went down. Plus, Sly has a noticeable character arc where he goes from being this lonely drunk looking to make a quick buck at the beginning to someone actively trying to save the universe with the loyalty of a crew. And the big subplot between him and Detta does get resolved, so there is actually something there to reward you for making it to the end. But yeah, I do still really wish there was a sequel. Okay, now it's time to move on to the gameplay. The first thing worth mentioning is that Anachronox plays much more like an adventure game than an RPG. There is turn-based combat, but it doesn't really happen all that often, and the majority of gameplay is dedicated to exploring and searching for NPCs, clues, or items you need to progress, and occasionally completing puzzles or taking pictures with Sly's trusty camera. Fatima keeps track of your main objectives, but you still have to do a lot of investigating on your own to figure out exactly what to do next. It's very slow-paced because most of the environments are pretty big, and you often need to cover a lot of ground to get to where you're going. The atmosphere and story elements make these areas fun to travel through and get immersed in, so I wasn't always bothered by this, but sometimes loading screens between zones and the amount of backtracking that's required can hamper enjoyment and bring the pacing down to a crawl. This is especially true if you decide to take on some of the side quests, where you have to return to certain places later in the game, and then sometimes run back and forth between very distant locations. I love that there are lots of little secrets hidden around the universe rewarding you with equipment or skills, but sometimes the amount of time and effort it takes to get them just doesn't feel worth it. The side content is totally optional though, and the fast forward button helps out a lot here, both for side quests and main quests. Another kind of adventure game element Anachronox has are upgradable world skills. These are ways to interact with the environment, which are attached to little mini-games unique to each party member. A few of them are very generic, like lockpicking or hacking, but there are definitely some more original ones too. Of course, Democritus has an amusing one because everything about it is ridiculous. But the best one by far is Grumpos's Yammer skill, where you have to help him suck a bunch of air into his lungs so that he can blabber away at NPCs and annoy them into giving you what you want. Just the idea of this is funny enough on its own, but you can actually read his insanely long speeches, which aren't quite gibberish and take his weirdness and grumpiness to a whole other level. There are a few other unrelated minigames like piloting a ship or a boat, which aren't really fun, but they're tolerable and brief. And also, if you lose these minigames, you're given an option to just skip them. combat is turn-based and has a similar style as PlayStation-era JRPGs, even with the little dance party animations that play after you win. Unfortunately, combat is also the weakest part of the game. Battles can feel simplistic and repetitive, and as I mentioned before, most of the enemies aren't all that interesting except for a couple of bosses. Also, a lot of the attack animations and the camera movements between attacks are very slow and drawn out, and not just when you use special skills or magic. Even regular attacks take a while, and there's this weird delay when you kill an enemy where it takes a couple of seconds for the game to even register that they're dead, which looks pretty silly. Battles in general just feel really sluggish. There's some strategy involved with things like moving around the battlefield, but it's usually very straightforward in the sense that you'll know instantly or beforehand what your next decision will be. So it's not like you use the extra time between turns strategizing and staying engaged. They definitely went for a more cinematic approach here, and some of the attacks do look kinda cool, but the spectacle wears off pretty quickly once you've seen them a few times. Thankfully, the fast forward button comes to the rescue again here too. Whoever patched this into the game absolutely knew what they were doing. There is an active time battle system, and you have to be sort of careful while fast forwarding, because enemies can and will keep attacking if you don't select an attack when it's someone's turn. But I thought combat was, for the most part, easy enough on normal difficulty that there's plenty of room for error here. Even though battles don't happen all that frequently, there are a handful of combat-heavy zones, which would have been just painful and time-consuming to get through without the fast-forward button. And even with it, a few of them felt too much like a chore. With all that being said, I'll go ahead and list a few things that I did like, or at least sorta liked, about the combat. First is that there are no random battles. Enemies are always in fixed locations, although they will respawn sometimes if you return to an area later. Also, you don't need to grind any battles in order to finish the game. My party never felt underleveled, even though I rarely engaged in extra combat, and even the endgame bosses weren't much trouble. However, I did do most of the side quests to get the really good weapons and skills, which helped out a lot, but most of these didn't require much, if any, combat. The only enemy who was a real problem was an extremely powerful secret boss, but fighting him is totally optional. A couple of character skills have less generic and amusing names like beefiness instead of strength, and beat instead of accuracy. And I kinda wish they had done this for all the skills, but maybe they were trying to avoid making things too confusing. The magic system uses this really interesting idea of letting you create your own spells by finding, leveling, and combining different colored beetles, which each represent a specific element. It's pretty neat collecting these and toying around with this, and the entire system is connected to an important development in the story, but it's also a little confusing and not explained very well. Plus, you don't unlock access to this until really far into the game, like beyond the halfway point, and you can also just find or purchase good spells without even using this system at all, which is usually a much simpler and easier way to get powerful magic. The final thing I liked, and probably my favorite part about combat overall, is Sly's hilarious meme face when he's using a skill or casting magic. Even with a few flaws, I think Anachronox is a tremendous RPG that's still worth experiencing today, if you can muster the patience for it. The old school style of adventuring and the slow pace won't be everyone's cup of tea, and it might have been better off without combat altogether. But its abundance of humor and uniquely weird and detailed universe still shine through all of this, and very brightly at that. Many of its characters and locations will stick with me for a long time, especially Democritus. If the gameplay seems like too big of a barrier for you, you can always check out the Anachronox movie, where the game's cinematic director combined all of the cutscenes into one long video. You'd be missing out on tons of great in-game dialogue, but you'd still get a solid taste of the story, universe, and humor. The chances of Anachronox ever actually getting its sequel seem to be virtually zero. It's a very old game at this point, and one that didn't sell very well. The IP is now owned by Square Enix, and in 2015 they announced through a program they run for indie developers that they would be open to hearing pitches for a new Anachronox game. Unfortunately, nothing ever came out of this. Will Square Enix ever consider a new Anachronox game again? Who knows? Only Eddie knows.
Eddie knows.